Many working with indigenous peoples talk about the radical redefinition of politics. So wow, it's not just any kind of challenge to politics, it's a radical redefinition of politics. Now every time you ask what this radical transformation of politics means, you will have as many answers as people you ask. But I'm going to focus on a few. This impact on politics has to do with the kind of demands that indigenous peoples across the continent are pushing for. In general, some of the most important demands that indigenous movements have include the recognition of indigenous peoples as such, the return of land through some sort of agrarian reform, and the recognition of territories that indigenous communities traditionally inhabit. Third, the recognition of traditional territories, in turn, leads to the right for autonomy and the expansion of spaces for the realization of that autonomy. This is usually referred to as self-determination, internal, not external. For those of you who are in political science, you know that there is a distinction there. We're not talking about political independence in the UN sense of the world, of this sort of southern Sudan recent example of countries breaking apart. We're talking about self-determination within the framework of the nation state. The last two predominant demands include the nationalization of the country's natural resources, and finally the recognition and respect of constitutional rights. That, for example, include the right for bilingual education, the right or the demand for countries to move beyond the idea that the only official language should be Spanish. Right? So I selected a few cases to give you just a snapshot of what we're at. And I don't know why I chose these cases. I think they each one says a little bit about the different shapes that the indigenous movements take. The first one is the Zapatista movement, and I think that's probably the most popular one. How many of you have some sort of Mexican background? Here? One? Okay. Not very representative, but I'm sure that everybody else has some sort of understanding of what the Zapatista movement entails, but if not, I'm going to give you a sense. Then I'm going to move to the three cases of the Andes, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Peru, and I'm going to finish with the cases of the Mapuche in Argentina and Chile. So very briefly, in Mexico, the estimated population of indigenous peoples is between 15 and 20% of the total population. So you can only imagine that when they mobilize, they're going to make some sort of impact. Mexico's indigenous movements, and others in the region, of course, gained national and international attention with the rebellion by the Zapatistas in Chiapas that started in January 1st, 1994. The Zapatistas, for example, challenged the notion of the limited capacity of indigenous peoples in Mexico to mobilize around indigenous demands. Before the Zapatistas, there was this very pessimistic view about indigenous peoples in Mexico. And basically that pessimist view had to do with the fact that despite being 15 to 20% of the population, they haven't really been able to mobilize with indigenous demands. I mean, they were part of unions, they were part of the revolutions earlier on, they were part as peasant organizations, but not as indigenous peoples. So many started to doubt whether that would be possible in Mexico at any point. The Zapatistas, though, challenged that notion, and in fact, their largely indigenous army mobilized significant support and compelled the Mexican government to engage in negotiations. The Zapatista agenda, for example, includes indigenous autonomy and cultural respect alongside democratization. While it remains subnational in origin and one among many localized indigenous movements in Mexico, the Zapatistas had, of course, an obvious national as well as international impact. But let's see a case in which the impact is much greater than anybody could have thought. Mobilized by the Confederación de las Nacionalidades Indígenas del Ecuador, or Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, the indigenous movement was instrumental, and listen to this, in removing 2 Ecuadorian presidents in 1997 and 2000, and as a result, occupied key ministries in the Lucio Gutiérrez administration of 2003 and from 2003 and 2005. So a huge impact in the traditional sense of politics. They were able to get rid of 2 presidents. They became ministers in the cabinet of one of them. But things didn't go too well afterward. That's the part that I'm going to tell you about. The CONAI, that confederation I was talking about, was formed in 1986, unifying the different indigenous groups of coast, sierra, and jungle. In other words, this is the only case in which a confederation was able to amalgamate, to bring together indigenous communities from different geographical regions of the country. This is the only place in the entire continent that happened. In Ecuador, the indigenous population, let me refresh in case you're not familiar with it, is estimated to be between 30 and 40% of the population. So again, the impact could be much, much bigger. In Ecuador, the movement, for example, was consolidated most effectively in the 1990 indigenous uprising. That's where basically they became protagonists. Recent political history in Ecuador, however, witnessed what some label a co-optation of CONAI when they became part of that Gutierrez administration that I mentioned before. As a result, the most ambitious effort to project the indigenous movement, for example, into economic policy implementation was basically a distinct failure. This experience left the indigenous movement in a weakened position, and the movement lost credibility for its role in bringing Gutierrez to power. The strongest indication of this effect was the CONAI's decision to sit out the January 21st, 2004 demonstrations that ignited the process that removed Gutierrez in April. So they basically were part of the cabinet, and then they decided to basically try to make him go away. The administration of Alfredo Palacio that continued 2004-2006 provided a new opportunity when he named, and this gets more recent, Rafael Correa as Minister of the Economy in 2005. Correa's policies were nationalistic and antagonistic to external international influences. His stance was quite consonant with indigenous peoples, but when Correa was forced to resign in August of 2005, this became the launchpad for his successful bid for the presidency in 2006. To finish, I'll give you a snapshot of where things are today. In the 2006 elections, Correa won in the second round over Álvaro Noboa, Ecuador's richest capitalist, as the media was doubting him at the time. The split indigenous movement running under Pachacutic supported Luis Macas, the head of CONAI. So they went as a separate candidate, who received, and this is a sad outcome, 2.2% of the vote in the first round and finished 6th. Correa appointed no indigenous representatives to his cabinet, although his policies were espoused by indigenous movements in the past. The demands for a plurinational state and the decision to maintain the indigenous movement's independence from the state defines the movement under Correa's administration. So after they basically went through toppling 2 presidents, being part of the cabinet, then leaving the administration, and basically with the Correa relationship never working out, even though in terms of policy they are both left-leaning and they're sort of supporting the same anti-neoliberal policies, they decided that the way to go from now in the future would be to maintain independence from the state. They just learned the lesson the hard way. But Bolivia is another interesting example. In Bolivia, we have what has been characterized in Ecuador as the conformation of a major confederation. In Bolivia, we have the opposite. The dispersion of the movement is its main characteristic. They were never able to combine the confederations into a single one. However, they ended up with the first indigenous people's president in the country. In Bolivia, people constitute the majority of the population, a clear one, 60 to 70%. Bolivia's contemporary indigenous movements are often described as heterogeneous and fragmented, with its origin in the late 1960s and early 1970s. A little bit of history just to see how far they came. By 1979, when probably some of your ancestors were born, I was born almost that year, the Cataristas assumed control of the military-dominated peasant organization, asserted greater independence from the National Labor Federation, and challenged the military peasant pact. So something started to take shape in 1979. While Catarismo as an organizational force did not sustain political momentum or unity, it has had a lasting impact on union and electoral politics, illustrated by the election of a Catarista, Victor Hugo Cárdenas, as vice president in 1993. So they got very close to power, this fraction of the indigenous movement. The Bolivian Amazon, on the other side, here the Catarista is more of an Andean organization. The Bolivian Amazon has since 1990 also become an active site of indigenous organizing around the regional confederation of indigenous peoples of Bolivia. But it was not until Evo Morales' first electoral victory in 2005, when he became the first indigenous president, that the Movimiento al Socialismo, the movement towards socialism, merged, put together indigenous activism with opposition to neoliberalism from socialist and populist sectors in support of an indigenous nationalist agenda, advocating indigenous rights and economic and popular democracy. Popular resistance to neoliberalism, however, had consolidated in the 1990s around the organization of coca growers under Morales and the Cochabamba water wars in the year 2000 that forced the reversal, for example, of water privatization. So we have to see the presidency of Evo Morales as a result of all these forces. Before Morales, basically the anti-neoliberal movement was pretty well consolidated in the way, for example, that in Ecuador was not. But what about Peru? Peru is kind of the black sheep in the literature of the Andes. Any Peruvian connection here? You are? Okay. In the literature on social movements, the first kind of thing that pops out when we look at Peru is that despite its indigenous population, indigenous movements barely existed as having the national kind of impact that it had in other countries. But here many are wondering, should we maybe stop talking about movements as the only way in which indigenous peoples can make a difference? And many studies are showing that in Peru, indigenous resistance takes place at a much more local level, which it's not the same kind of picture that we see in Bolivia and Ecuador. But that's why people are missing sometimes Peru and sort of becomes the exception.